First of all, I introduce Victoria Schofield, historian, international affairs commentator, and acknowledged specialist in South Asia. She's traveled widely in South Asia, and her interest in the region was sustained by a long friendship with the late Benazir Bhutto, former Prime Minister of Pakistan. She's one of the world's leading experts on Jammu and Kashmir, lectured around the world, has books on Kashmir, and is a frequent contributor to British newspapers, BBC, Al Jazeera, and other outlets. I would also like to introduce Dr. Christopher Snedden, who's a professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Since 2014, he's a former intelligence analyst and security practitioner, specializing in South Asia, the Indian Ocean, Australia, and Australasia. He's been involved in South Asian matters since 1981, has worked in the Australian government and university sectors, and as a consultant. He's also visited Jammu and Kashmir and interviewed many elderly statesmen involved in the Kashmir dispute. His publications also include groundbreaking work on Kashmir. So I would like to welcome our speakers today, and I think Dr. Snedden is going to get started with some PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. I'm going to start, ladies and gentlemen, just give you a brief overview to give you some context about the Kashmir Valley. Now, I presume that you all realise there's been a bit of upheaval since the 8th of July when a militant was killed. And since then, there's been over 2,400 clashes. All of the schools have closed, 30 of which have been burned. 70 other public buildings have been damaged. There's been very few tourists who've gone there, although fruit exports surprisingly have increased out of the valley. Between 76 and 100 people have been killed. There's 1,000 people with eye injuries. Thousands have been wounded, including 6,500 in the security forces alone, not to mention other people in the Kashmir Valley, and 6,000 have been arrested. So it's a very volatile situation. Now, just to give you some context, this is an old photo. You don't see that sort of transport anymore. Some people do consider it to be one of the most beautiful places in the world, and the academic's friend is there, of course, arguably. But it is a very beautiful place. This is the areas that we're talking about. So India administers, India claims all of it, but is actually in control of 3 areas: Ladakh, the Kashmir Valley, where the middle arrow is up here, and the Jammu area. Pakistan administers 2 until the plebiscite is held, the United Nations plebiscite is held, that will resolve the issue according to Pakistan. So in the meantime, it's administering 2 areas, and China also controls 2 areas. Just one particular thing to bear in mind is that when Pakistanis are talking about Kashmir, often they're talking about people from the former princely state or from Azad Kashmir or both. When the Indians are talking about Kashmir, they're usually talking about people from the Kashmir Valley, this area up there. So sometimes they're talking at different purposes with one another. Now, this is a photo of Dal Lake, and these are the 3 of the particular things that the Kashmir Valley has that are significant. It's been a tourist destination for a long period of time, going back to Mughal times, and even before then. The 4th Mughal emperor called it paradise, and when he was dying, he was asked if there was anything he'd like, and he said only Kashmir. But even in 1946, there were about 20,000 Britishers, as the people called people from the former empire that ruled it, the British. They were in the Kashmir Valley, and water is very significant both for tourism, these are houseboats, and also for water downstream going into Pakistan ultimately, and for hydroelectricity. And fruit is and other things are major exports. That's what it looks like, and essentially it is a valley surrounded by mountains. That's the Kashmir Valley there. This is one of the major rivers, the Jhelum, so everything to the east is Jammu and Kashmir. This is a major water storage facility that's just within one of the Pakistan-administered areas and is significant for both hydroelectricity and for water storage. This is the area we're talking about, and it is prestigious. It's an area that's been renowned historically for thousands of years. The Kashmiris say that Moses is buried in the Kashmir Valley. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't really matter, but it's been known for a long period of time. They can trace a line of kings back to about 250 BC. So it's quite significant. That's a map, forgive the typo, but it was the only map of the Kashmir Valley that I could find. And so you can see it's this flat area, and the figures are such that it's about, what would you say, Victoria, how many miles, by miles?
80 to 90 long and 20 to 25 miles.
And if you're into kilometres, 140 kilometres long by about 35 kilometres wide. So not very large, but very significant. And the significant factor is that both India and Pakistan would really like to possess this particular part of the subcontinent. So, since 1988, there's been a significant anti-India uprising by the people in the Kashmir Valley, particularly Muslims. There were about 5% of the population that were Hindus. Most of those have left, mainly because they felt threatened. It was indigenous. It was started by Kashmiris, and for the first 3 years or so was really just them, and then other forces got involved. So these are some Kashmiris in the 90s, and you know they're Kashmiris because of this particular dress. It's called a ferran. It's a very loose article of clothing that's really only worn in the Kashmir Valley. But over time, they've become much more sophisticated and much better organised and armed, and they're looking much more like a militia. And it's debatable what Pakistan's role is, but they've certainly had a role in arming, training, motivating some of these anti-Indian elements. And if you listen to the Indian side, they say Pakistan's responsible for all of it. It's not quite the case, and we'll talk more about that. But the current situation is that this fellow, who was a Kashmiri belonging to this force, there's a number of forces there, but this is the main Kashmiri one called the Hizbul Mujahideen. He was killed on the 8th of July, some people say assassinated, and since then there's been this huge upheaval with between 76 and 100 people killed. And so why have they yet again become disenchanted with India? And I say again because it's been going back to 1988. And a few years ago there were 100 people killed in stone throwing incidents when they said to the Indians, we're not happy then, and now again it's re-emerged. So it's an ongoing challenge, and these are some of the factors. So they're angry, and it's young folk, and it seems that they're leaderless. They're throwing stones, they're creating problems for the Indian security forces. They appear to be self-organising, and they're certainly using social media. But another factor is curfews. For almost the whole time since the 8th of July, the Kashmir Valley has been under curfew, which makes it very difficult for you to live, to shop, to get to school, and people haven't been going to school for that particular reason. And these are some Indian security forces who are totally different looking from the Kashmiris. The Kashmiris are fairly light-skinned. A lot of the Indians, particularly from South India, stand out as being different, and that's a challenge as well. That street normally, on a normal business day, would have a lot of people, a lot of cars, a lot of motorbikes, but that's it during the curfew. And then up here, this is the great tragedy, that the Indian security forces, the paramilitaries, have been using pellet guns to try and control the crowds, and in doing so have injured a whole heap of people. And now some of the Kashmiris are saying this is the year of dead eyes because of these injuries, and it's very sad. They could aim them lower to cause injury to their knees or whatever, but unfortunately they've been shooting high, and in fact why do they need to use pellet guns is one of the issues. Aren't there better ways to try and control crowds? It's very difficult if you're in the security forces, of course, you're being attacked, you do seek to defend yourself. So it's a very difficult situation. And some of the others, now I believe the Indians are perplexed, and Victoria will give you her opinion on that. They don't exactly know what to do, and they're perplexed for a whole variety of reasons. And this is the current Prime Minister and the current Governor. He's been the Governor since 2008, and the Chief Minister, who's actually a Kashmiri. And the Home Minister has been up there, but he also, I think, is a little perplexed. And that's the Chief Minister with him, and they did a press conference together, and that's the snap suggesting that on that particular issue they had a little bit of a disagreement perhaps. And I think the Kashmiris also are perplexed. These are some people from the All Parties Hurriyat Conference, the All Parties Freedom Conference, and they would like resolutions they perhaps would like the United Nations resolution implemented so that there could be a plebiscite, but they want people to engage in more hartals, they're called, strikes, so to keep the place shut down and to show that the Indians that they're disenchanted. He's the elder statesman, Gilani. He's one of the ones who was involved instigating the dispute in 1988. He took up arms and has since renounced them, and he's the son of a religious leader who was killed very early on in the anti-India uprising as well, and they're significant. There are other players as well, but they're the sort of the poles. They're one on the left and they're on the right to some extent in terms of their aspirations. And the conundrum, so they clearly want freedom, or I believe they want freedom, these people in the Kashmir Valley, but the conundrums are those. They are severely disenchanted and have been for a period of time. And some of the other questions, and this is where I bring in my colleague, and welcome to Honolulu, Victoria. It's great to have you here. Victoria I've known only for a couple of years, but I've known of her work for many years before that. We finally met a couple of years ago, and it's just fortuitous that Victoria's here. So I don't know, over to you. What you would perhaps like to pick one of those and say something about it.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Burr, and thank you to the East West Centre. Delighted to be in Honolulu for the first time, I hate to say, in 30 years. But I have been focusing actually for about that amount of time on the Kashmir issue, as we call it, the Kashmir dispute. I think, and I think your presentation is excellent just to give an overview of what actually has been an issue between India and Pakistan since 1947. And one of the problems with discussing the issue is it a territorial issue? Is it merely which country should the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir be part of, be assigned to? Should it be India? Should it be Pakistan? And this is what was expected in 1947, was that the then ruler would choose to attach his state to one or other country. And as Christopher's explained, this did not happen. Although the Maharaja, under a certain amount of duress, joined a temporary accession to India, that was supposed to have been confirmed by a plebiscite referendum reference to the people. And so when we say, what do the Kashmiris want? We want freedom. For a lot of the inhabitants of the valley, they're reverting back to this rhetoric, to this narrative which began in 1947. We want a plebiscite. We want our right of self-determination. And that means that this unfulfilled sort of democratic process they want put in place. And this has been part of the political challenge, which has been both a political movement and also then when it spills over into frustration, and the frustration in 1988 was because of some elections that were held in 1987 which were perceived to have been rigged, and so it spills over into militancy. And at that time I interviewed militants, young militants, who said, we tried the political process, we've taken up the gun. And I think it's really important with understanding the Kashmir issue is to put it in context of what was going on in the rest of the world at that time. We just had a decade of freedom fighting against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And a lot of these videos that we saw were inspired that if we take up the gun, we are freedom fighters. We're not militants, we're not terrorists, we are freedom fighters. And so within the context of that belief, that's why they took up the gun at that time. But as we know, the Indian government was very opposed to any change in the status. In fact, it tolerates the fact that, as you saw on the map, Pakistan occupies approximately 1/3 of the state, which it occupied in 1948. 49, and that's where the ceasefire line was agreed to really try and diffuse the situation. Britain at that time was very concerned about what it called an inter-dominion war, because at that time both the Pakistan and Indian armies were staffed by British officers at the top, and so they were very keen to have this dialogue and consequently have this plebiscite. But what I always say is that the problem with the plebiscite, and that does get on to the UN resolutions choice here, because the UN resolutions were put in place to manage the holding of the plebiscite. Again, this is another myth that the UN resolutions actually prescribe the plebiscite. The rulers of Pakistan and India agreed to hold the plebiscite, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Jawaharlal Nehru. They agreed that this was a fair way forward, and the UN was brought in to work out how that plebiscite was going to be held, and part of that was withdrawal of troops so that people didn't feel intimidated. And I think this is the difficulty that we face now, is that the plebiscite has become sort of an objective, but very difficult to carry out, because both sides agreed to it at the time, because they thought they would win it. And ever since then, you've had this sort of shifting that we don't want to hold the plebiscite because we actually talk about wanting to hold the plebiscite, but you can't have a method of adjudication if you're not prepared to lose that, to be the loser. And I think this is one of the problems when we discuss the holding of the plebiscite, is that it's put forward, and currently India has not wanted to hold the plebiscite. It says that we've had elections, the people of Kashmir have voiced their opinion, they're content with their status, and so the plebiscite is totally irrelevant. And I think I would say that the UN resolutions, and as I say, being the forum within which the plebiscite should be held, if you look at it in today's world, you have these areas, 1/3 under Pakistan administration, 2/3 under Indian administration. Most of those regions of the former princely state are content, I would say, with their status. So we get back to the valley, that area we saw on the map, that smallish, relatively small territorial area, but most populous. And this is where the conundrum also arises, because essentially, if you are talking about one man, one vote, what the valley decides would be what would happen to the rest of the state. And this is sometimes lost sight of. And we've seen that very large area under Pakistan administration, it used to be called the northern areas, it's now called Gilgit-Baltistan. It is totally 100% Muslim. It totally wants to remain part of Pakistan. So I think what I would say, in a rather long-winded way, just having given you that bit of extra background, is that if the plebiscite were to be held today, it would probably not bring peace, because you would have disaffected minorities, inevitably. And it's a difficult thing to say, because we believe in the democratic process, we believe in the choices of people, but with an area that has such disparate groups, we talk about, as in Jammu and Kashmir, we talk about Indian administered Kashmir, but within that you've got Ladakh, which is the Ladakhis, they're Buddhist, they would have different aspirations. You've got the Jammu region, which is 2/3 Hindu. You have also got Muslims there, but they're not Kashmiri speakers. It's much more complex. It's very difficult to sort of boil down to sort of one or two words. And I think, so the answer is that the holding a plebiscite, the UN resolutions, would not bring peace. The role of Pakistan does still continue to nudge the issue, and as Christopher rightly says, the disaffection is an indigenous movement within the valley, but there's no doubt that Pakistan saw what was going on in the valley and decided that perhaps after all, because of its long-standing enmity with India, this would be an opportunity to maybe move into the valley, to get the valley. So there's no doubt that these young men have been assisted by Pakistan. Pakistan's official position is its help is diplomatic and moral, but there's no doubt that it's been military and material. So that's my sort of first point on that.
So yeah, we're happy to take questions, but I just wanted to mention too, this word freedom in Kashmiri, they talk about azadi. The UN plebiscite only gives them an option of either joining Pakistan or India. So the people will vote, and the whole of Jammu and Kashmir will either join India or Pakistan. But these people in the Kashmir Valley have clearly said, many of them, perhaps a majority, we don't know because it's impossible to poll them, we want azadi. we don't want to join either. We want to be a separate nation. And the UN plebiscite doesn't offer them that opportunity. So that's a further aspect of this supposed conundrum.
And I mean, one of the conundrums actually is using the word azadi, which is how you interpret it, which brings us on to our greater autonomy. And I do remember being in the valley interviewing a young militant, and I was performing the role as a journalist saying, what are you fighting for? And again, I had his answer, we want azadi. And I said, what do you mean by azadi? Well, freedom, we want our freedom. And I said, you mean independence? He said, well, yes, sort of independence. And then I said, do you mean independence of the whole state, which would require both India and Pakistan to vacate the regions, Gilgit-Baltistan, Azad Kashmir, etc., etc. And he said, no, we just want independence of the valley, which is this strong feeling in the valley. And so, being slightly provocative, I said, well, that's interesting, but it gets very cold in the winter. What are you going to do in the winter when the passes are shut? And he said, oh, well, I'll go to my house in Jammu. And so, this is a tragedy of it, because it's not what we call choreographed, it's an aspiration. And what I think I feel very strongly and passionate about is that young boys, the statistics we've heard, are dying for an aspiration that hasn't really been choreographed. They haven't been able to think through what we really mean by it. The idea initially was that Kashmir, the state of Jammu and Kashmir, would become part of India, but would retain autonomy. And it's difficult to do counterfactual history, as we know, but the autonomy was relatively untouched in the late 1940s up until 1953. They were to keep their own flag, they were to have a president, not have a president, Sadr Riyasat. It was not to be looking like a similar state to India, but that was gradually eroded. And in 1953, when the then leader of Kashmir, Sheikh Abdullah, was put under arrest, the move to integrate that region under Indian administration into India was sort of put into effect. And so really the autonomy has been eroded. And it's one reason why it's very difficult to get back to talking about autonomy, because it's sort of become a dirty word. It's, well, our autonomy was eroded, so that's why you get into freedom and azadi, because it's sort of, it defines more for what they want. It's a feeling that, you know, we had our autonomy, but that was taken away from us.
And the other aspect too is that, in answer to the second one, I think India is treating this as a law and order issue. They're not seeing it as a political issue, either in terms of giving these people more autonomy or talking to Pakistan. India, in my opinion, has a blind spot about them. And I say my opinion because even though I work for the US government, what I'm saying here now is my own opinion. This does not reflect the official position of the United States government or the Indian government or the Pakistan government or anybody else. This is just my opinion. Maybe even my wife would disagree with me as well, so it's clearly my opinion. But the role of Pakistan now, India, I think, has a blind spot with Pakistan, and it's not even saying to Pakistan there's a political issue. It's saying to Pakistan the big challenge, the big issue, the big question is, when are you going to vacate those parts of Jammu and Kashmir that you're occupying? And it's a denial of reality that everybody in those parts wants to go to India. They don't. As Victoria said, they're quite happy being with Pakistan. So the Indians, I think, part of the reason why there's been such casualties is because they, not just this year, but for a long period of time, have considered it to be a law and order issue. This area is part of India, and they just have to obey our laws. And with the current government, which tends to be a bit more hard line than the previous government, it's our way, or not at all, basically. And I think they've been a little excessive in terms of how they've controlled the situation.
And what I think is also true, is that there's, in a way, been a backpedaling, because in the early 1970s, after the secession of Bangladesh, it really was a sort of feeling, well, you keep what you've got and we keep what we've got. And this is why the ceasefire line was then changed to be called the line of control in the 1972 Shimla Agreement. But now there is a constant reminder by the Indian government that Pakistan is occupying. They refer, POK is what they call what the Pakistanis call Azad Jammu and Kashmir. They call it POK, Pakistan Occupied Kashmir. And if you go into any tourist office, or if you're trying to get a map within India, you will not see that line of control highlighted. You will see the whole of the state as part of India, including right up to Chitral in northern Pakistan, which includes the Gilgit-Baltistan region. So I agree, there is a sort of blind spot that if you can't even acknowledge that there is a line of control, and that you keep insisting that this is all part of the state of India based on the Maharaja's temporary accession, as it was called then, you're sort of treading on water and not really getting onto any dry land at all.
So this map reflects the actual situation on the ground. If I was to publish that map in an Indian book, or a book published in India, potentially I could be charged with sedition and thrown in jail. And I speak from experience because I'm trying to have a book republished in India now that has that as the third map. The other two are quite acceptable because they're historic. But this one, the Indians say no, you have to show it all as being Indian territory. Even though Pakistan does administer two of those areas and China controls two of those areas. And India's never been into those two areas that Pakistan administers. So it's rather unusual.
Should we just talk about the role of China? Because I often get asked whether the Chinese should be a player, should be brought into the negotiations. And the region they occupy, which is the Aksai Chin here, claimed by India, controlled by China, in the late 1950s, the Chinese government built it's roughly 100 miles, that line that you can see, road, in order to give greater, easier access, instead of having to go the whole way round on the Katman Desert, which is very difficult terrain, from Xinjiang to Tibet. And again, put it in context, at that time the Chinese were moving into Tibet. So they did it purely for logistical reasons, but there are no inhabitants in that area. And it wasn't until a couple of years that some Indian patrols came and found what the Chinese had done. And so on the basis that they're inhabiting a region that doesn't have any people, I tend to argue against them being considered in any way a player. The other little area, perhaps one might say without realizing the consequences, because it brought a halt to some talks that were being held in 1962-63, Pakistan ceded, it's the Kunlun Mountains up here, the CTC region, to China because they wanted to sort of shore up their frontier. Again, it's totally uninhabited, totally mountainous region, but it suited the Chinese better because, as you know, they have a border dispute with India further along. And it meant that the Indian government broke off the 62-63 talks, saying that Pakistan had ceded areas of territory which were not theirs to cede. And they went off in high dudgeon because of Pakistan's action. But that's what those two regions are, controlled by China. And the fact that the line of control stops at this point, NJ 980420, is because you've got the Siachen Glacier, you've got totally impossible terrain. But in 1984, the Indians airlifted troops in a preemptive strike, and the world's highest battle zone is currently on the Siachen Glacier, where more men die of frostbite than do in an fact war. They're doing horrific damage to the environment up there, which is another of my interests. Because we've got troops occupying a glacier. The Indians are on the upper region and the Pakistan forces are in a more disadvantaged position. But again, neither country, they've come close to resolving the Siachen Glacier, but they have not resolved it because neither country wants to give away any advantage that they have.
And they don't trust each other either, which is another factor. Now, were there any questions? Yes, please.
You both of you presented the problem very well. Any solution from your point?
Any solution?
Yeah, I know you're going to go back to India, but you don't want to in any trouble, but still, from personal.
Well, I have a personal solution, but Victoria, do you want to answer that one first, and then I'll...
So, from a human point of view.
Humans? Oh, there's humans involved, yes, of course.
I mean, again, speaking, my point of view is personal, and it comes from
Right.
long years of study and hundreds of interviews, is that I really would like a table like this, surrounded by Kashmiris, and the doors shut, and have all, I mean, again, as I say, it's so difficult, and we as journalists, we get lazy, we talk about the Kashmir issue, it is the Jammu and Kashmir issue, but there are different types of Jammuites and Kashmiriites and the Ladakhis, and I really feel that they need to have an opportunity to air, to give oxygen to what they feel is this idea of self-determination. What do they mean by Azadi? And somehow, if they can have that dialogue, they will perhaps see that some of their aspirations aren't answerable, aren't fulfillable because it's impractical. And how much do they want to trade with India? How much do they want to trade with Pakistan? I know that Pakistan has nurtured this feeling that if they were given the freedom of choice, the state, as I said, now they've really turned down and they realize that there's only a proportion of inhabitants of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, even a small proportion in the valley, that might like to become part of Pakistan. And I remember when I first went to the Kashmir Valley in 1981, I didn't have the historical knowledge I now have, but I asked some carpet weavers, I said, would you like, what Muslim would you like to be part of Pakistan? And I'm afraid it was the era of General Zia, and he looked at me like I was a complete idiot and said, under military dictatorship, no, we thought in 47 we might go to Pakistan, but actually, Pakistan, you have to hold up the mirror to their types of government. But I do think that the first step is that you've never really had an intra-Kashmiri inhabitants dialogue. And I think it's absolutely essential that they're given the dignity that they deserve because they're their inhabitants. I remember talking to Yasin Malik and he said, we're not cattle that we should be sold and just pushed here and pushed there. We have a thought, and we can't really negate the feeling that arose in 1846 when the British sold the Valley of Kashmir to Gulab Singh. They did so in return for money. They needed money to pay their troops. But that's also part of the Kashmiri psyche, is that they were sold by the British, and they kind of feel that they keep being traded off by two countries. It's not a territorial dispute. India and Pakistan might like to treat it as a territorial dispute, but it's also a humanitarian dispute. And I think sometimes within the rhetoric that's used, that gets lost sight of.
My solution is very similar to Victoria's. If you have a look at the area of Jammu and Kashmir, it's about 85,000 square miles. It's actually larger in the area and certainly more populous than, there's some figures, there's some areas, etc., etc. It's actually larger in area and more populous than two existing states in South Asia already, Bhutan and the Maldives. The Maldives is only about 400,000 people and very scattered islands and not very much territory at all. This would be much more significant. So they've got an aspiration. There are three parties to the dispute, India, Pakistan, and the third party is the people. But the people are actually the first party for two reasons. One, it's about their particular lands, and secondly, they instigated, in my opinion, and my research suggests this, that they instigated the Kashmir dispute before India and Pakistan were officially involved or unofficially involved, and so they have a stake in it. And like Victoria, I would like to see India and Pakistan devolve the issue to them, because history shows us that India and Pakistan haven't been able to resolve it. There are some agreements between India and Pakistan, most of which, the successful ones, have involved a third party. For example, the Indus Waters Treaty, which divides the waters of Punjab between India and Pakistan, was brokered with the assistance of the World Bank. The 1949 ceasefire was brokered by the United Nations. So after the 1971 war that resulted in the dismemberment of Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh, India and Pakistan signed this similar agreement, which essentially said, certainly according to India, everything between India and Pakistan now is bilateral. No third parties, no United Nations, nobody else. But there is a clause within that that says that they can agree these are not the exact words, but this is what it amounts to. They can agree to devolve an issue to another mutually agreeable party. So I'm saying to them, devolve it to the people who live there and let their representatives, however they determine them. There are legislative assemblies in Azad Kashmir, in Gilgit-Baltistan. There's a legislative assembly on the Indian side and a legislative council, so there are representative bodies. Let their representatives get together and meet and continue to meet for as long as it takes. They can meet in Srinagar, then in Jammu City, and then in Muzaffarabad, and then in Gilgit, wherever, for as long as it takes, and let them determine what solution or solutions that they want for their particular region. And then let India and Pakistan keep them informed, and let's see what happens. And if they can't resolve it, give it back to India and Pakistan. Well, I'm not expecting that to happen, because India and Pakistan have been very paternalistic and don't really want to consult.
I think the important point is the strategic location, because although there aren't minerals that we know about, the water is very important for both countries. India being the upper riparian state, Pakistan lower riparian, but that Indus water, and they're very keen to control the region because it controls the water.
They are, but unfortunately there's a hell of a lot of pride in all of this too. It's a zero-sum game. It's like two children. I've got the toy, you can't have it. And when you've got it, I want it. And there's a hell of a lot of mistrust. Sorry. Yes.
Hi, thank you both very much. This was fascinating. I wanted to raise the recent open debate on women, peace and security on Resolution 1325 at the UN in October, and just shine that perspective on these two solutions that you've raised. What is the role of women currently, and what do you see as the role of women in any kind of peace negotiation? And I raise that because I was very interested to see some data that showed that where women play a meaningful role in peace negotiations, you're likely to have a longer lasting negotiation. I think it's 20% more after 2 years and 35% after 10 years. And we've seen a dearth of women involved as mediators, chief negotiators, etc. But we know that this is an issue that is of more interest at the UN, and I'd be fascinated in your views on what is happening with regard to inclusivity in this current issue.
Well, the chief minister of the Indian side is currently a woman. But we were talking about dynasties earlier, and she's the daughter of a very senior politician. So she is very skilled in her own right, but she's partly got that position because of her father, unfortunately.
And there are very few women on either side. I'm afraid there's still, in both regions, a great deal of chauvinism. And I think, as far as I know, particularly in the Kashmir Valley, the most women are doing, and it's totally tragic, is setting up groups for their disappeared sons and husbands. And that's about the full extent of their influence. And it's pretty sad, because one of the it's reported but underreported aspects is what's happened to there's something in the region of 10,000 disappeared Kashmiris, young Kashmiris and its militants. There are a tremendous number of orphans. There are what's called half widows, because again they cannot be married because they don't know what's happened to their husbands, and of course the mothers can't leave for their sons, and that's about the sum total of their activities. It's, you know, they don't have the sort of liberties that we have anyway. It's very difficult, you know, for Kashmiris to travel. Again, I know Christopher would know this as well. When we travel with Kashmiris, we flash them UK, US, you know, Australian passport. Off we go through a checkpoint. They get subjected to, you know, rigorous searching. It's not a happy life up there because of this very heavy Indian Army presence. The Indian Army will not withdraw its presence because it's constantly on the alert and lookout for what we call cross-border terrorism, infiltration from across the Pakistani side. This is why this resolution is important also with India and Pakistan, because until India feels confident it's not going to withdraw its troops, while the troops remain there, we continue to have human rights abuses, because obviously an occupying army presents that danger. And so it requires these dialogues on several levels, as Christopher rightly points out. And India has decided that it doesn't want to do mediation. My feeling is that some kind of, whether you call it facilitation, whatever word you use, mediation or interlocuteur, would help, because in a way it might sort of prick the bubble of status quo, and enable, possibly use a scapegoat. In Britain, we did use the United States for Northern Ireland. Sometimes it helps. But the Indian government has been very adamant and gets very, very angry when even another foreign country even mentions Kashmir in dialogue.
So, that said though, the women in all of the 5 regions are entitled to vote and do vote. It's voluntary voting. Are you from Australia or New Zealand?
I'm a quasi vote.
Okay. Well, in Australia we have compulsory voting. We are compelled to vote. So we get high turnouts, because if you don't, you get fined. But in that part of the world, voting is voluntary, and the percentages are about 65% on average. So they're consulted through the electoral process, but I haven't seen any major WPS type movements where women, apart from the disappeared children and those sorts of things, and protesting, they partake.
They do protest. They're out on the streets. Yeah, they are out in the streets.
But there's no sort of, generally speaking, any cross LOC or other. They do tend to be less high profile than women.
How does Sunni-Shia relationships feed into this?
Sunni Shia.
Well, there is an issue in this area up here, Gilgit-Baltistan. This was a Shia majority area. There's also Shias here in Kargil. So this area, Ladakh, very lightly populated. They're either Buddhist or Shia. Now those Shias don't necessarily want to join Pakistan, because if you're aware, there's a very nasty organisation in Pakistan called the Sepah-e-Sabah, which is essentially anti-Shia and been killing Shias. So they're probably, if it came to the choice, pro-Indian. But up in the north, there used to be a thing, there still is a thing called state subject status. If you want to buy immovable property, in other words land, in Jammu and Kashmir, based on the Maharaja's Act of 1928, you have to confirm and be able to show that you're a state subject, that your forebears are from this part of the world, before you can buy land. Now, it still applies in all the other 4 regions apart from Gilgit, where Pakistan has allowed it not to apply. And as a result of that, since the early 70s, a lot of Sunnis have moved into that area, and it's probably about 2/3 Shia now and about 1/3 Sunni. And as a result of that, there's been ethnic and religious tensions there. There are occasional incidents in the Kashmir Valley of Sunni-Shia violence, and historically that was an issue a long, long time ago, but generally speaking, no. The Kashmiris talk about a thing called Kashmiriat, which means essentially inclusivity. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're a Kashmiri, you're welcome here. And they say that they want these Hindus, pundits they're called, to come back, that 5% of the population, most of whom fled after the anti-India uprising started in 1988. So they're not religiously intolerant. They're fairly generous in terms of their practice of Islam. So it's not really an issue to any extent apart from Gilgit-Baltistan.
And the Gilgit-Baltistan, that is the issue. It's far less it wants to be part of Pakistan. It was actually the Balawaristan National Front where they wanted independence, because it's a conglomerate of little states, the Gilgit-Baltistan region. But their main issues, right, as Christopher said, is between Shia Sunni and Pakistanis, and they've been really wanting to become more part of Pakistan because of the benefits, and it really rose into an issue when, having built the Karakoram highway right up to Punjab, the Pakistanis put a taxation point up here, and there was a movement, no taxation without representation, because they weren't
Anybody
represented.
in the US heard of that slogan?
Yes. They weren't represented in the National Assembly. So that's been their biggest issue, has been sorting out their relationship with Pakistan rather than anything else.
You had a question.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Kashmir, and when Burhan Wani was killed, which was on the 8th, I was in Gulmarg with my family.
Okay.
So my family still lives there. As you had mentioned, are Kashmiris confused? Well, Kashmiris, they come from a lineage of the high Brahmins. So So they were converted to Islam. So they still have those peaceful attitudes, and which we call Kashmiriya. So they all get together. So when it started in 1990, but if you look back at 1997, there was an intelligence community created, Kukapare. Nice. Yes, so what he did is, now the Kashmiris, they did not want any Azadi. They were the followers of Kukapare. So what happens is the Kashmiris, they would follow whichever side they find is going towards the better. Do they want to go with the Pakistan? Not necessarily. Do they want to go with India? Not necessarily. So it reminds me, we were little kids when Bhutto was killed. Everybody came out and started shouting against Zul Haq. And when Zul Haq died, they came and raised the slogans in favor of Zul Haq. So they changed quite a bit. It is interesting, but the Kashmiris are very peaceful people, and if they are taking the gun and if they are doing all those things, it's because neither Pakistan nor India is interested in solving the problem. Because India gets the money which is unaccounted for, and unaccounted money goes to all the police officers. They do not want it to settle, because then they're not getting any money, and that's why it lingers on.
I think it's it's the war dividend, and I've heard Kashmiris say what we need is the peace dividend. People have to see, in the agencies, they have to see the benefits of the peace dividend, that they'd actually make more money if it was peaceful. But you're absolutely right, the status quo has enabled certain groups to profit from the status quo, and there is that sort of subterranean resistance to resolution, because it will upset their games.
Yeah, what you say about the Kashmiris being peace-loving is correct. It was quite surprising that the Kashmiris took up arms in It became violent in 1989, seriously 1989-90. It started in 1988 when they bombed a telegraph office. But they were considered by the British to be not a martial race. So when the British took people into the British Indian Army, if you were a martial race, you could essentially qualify to join the Indian Army. So Sikhs, Marathis from down south, from around the Mumbai area, and Madrasis and various other folk were considered to be martial races. The Kashmiris weren't, so they weren't allowed to join. And one of the reasons why they apparently wear that article of clothing, the ferran, which I showed earlier, was because apparently, where is it? Sorry, I've lost it, but that very loose article of clothing, when the Mughals captured the Kashmir Valley in 1586, the Kashmiris were considered to be martial people, and one of the ways, allegedly, they subdued that martial mentality that they had was to make them wear this ferran, which is a very loose article of clothing. You can bring your arms within it, and often they wear a little charcoal burner to keep themselves warm. The women call it their winter husband, the men call it their winter wife, and it is. I've used it. It's very, very nice on a very cold Kashmiri morning.
It's called Kangri, yes.
But it also meant that you couldn't pull your sword out of its scabbard terribly easily because your hands were inside this very loose article of clothing. And apparently they did that because the Kashmiris were martial. So when they started this violent uprising in 1989, people went, wow, this is really surprising because these people were considered by some to be cowards. So, but, if you push people far enough and long enough and hard enough, eventually they'll say enough. And that's what the Kashmiris said. Yeah, sorry, Susan, you'll be next. Yeah.
Oh, you want to go first?
No, please.
So since July 8th, there's been unrest in the valley, protests, and curfews are going on. They're kind of coming off of that, but the Hurry-Up group, they keep setting up those protest schedules and the shutdowns. The media keeps counting by days, like right now it's like 130 or something since July 9th. Do you foresee this continuing longer, or do you think it's kind of going to go down and they're going to stop counting? And when would that happen?
Well, I think it's going to start now because it's to do with the weather, if nothing else. It's now starting to get very cold. If you saw that photo, This is what Kashmir is like in winter. It's really cold, and one of the coldest nights of my life was spent under a mountain of blankets in Srinagar in December. It's really cold, and so two things happen. People don't do a lot of the social things because it's too cold, and secondly, the administration physically moves from Srinagar to Jammu City. It's called the Durbar. The administration, they pack it all up in boxes and put them on trucks, and they all move down to the warmer climes in winter, and then when it's stinking hot on the plains of India, they move to the cooler, where it's about 10 degrees cooler in the Kashmir Valley. So if they want to protest against the government's not there. They've physically moved. So it's likely that it will subdue. And then there's the factor of entropy, I suppose, too. You know, people get a bit tired with protesting, and they need to regather, and the hundred people being killed and all of those injuries, and you know, it's hard work protesting. It's not easy, and the shops have been shut. It's really difficult to get them supplies, and so I think people eventually say, let's have a respite and wait till it gets a bit warmer, and then people probably, and it may not be next year, maybe the year after, but they're still frustrated, they're still disenchanted, and so at some stage, unless the Indians can successfully address that, not as a law and order issue, but as a political issue, and say, we're going to give you something, more autonomy or whatever it might be, the reasons are still there, and it will really emerge at some stage.
I wanted to make a point, actually, sorry, just about the symbiotic relationship between Srinagar and Jammu. It's another reason why it's difficult to sort of separate the two. And you often talk about, as I say, the young Kashmiri who wanted independence just of the valley, but there has traditionally been this connection between summer capital Srinagar, winter capital Jammu. And so even though they are very different regions, it's Jammu and Kashmir. It's had that relationship back and forward, which makes sort of the territorial idea of separation more difficult. I just wanted to add that.
And they did try to move the capital, but they couldn't, because there were protests in both cities we want the capital, and
Because
the other one said, no, you can't have it, we want it.
it.
And so the compromise is they keep moving. It's not terribly efficient, and it's expensive, but it's how they do it.
This Hurry Up conference, they seem to be getting a lot of media coverage, especially back in the media. How much influence do you think they actually have for the people of Kashmir? Do people actually listen to them?
Yeah,
Or
a
is
certain
it just
segment of the
media
population do. But there are some Kashmiris who are actually pro-Indian. There are some Kashmiris, including followers of that fellow Gilani, who are actually very strongly pro-Pakistan. So there's a variety of opinions. The Hurriyat have said we don't want to participate in the democratic process for elections and that sort of thing. So the Kashmiris vote for their representatives, and there are some people who support the democratic process as well. So there are a variety of representatives, and they're just another group of their representatives to some extent. But they do have some influence.
One of the problems of the Hurriyat is because of the Indian government. The same actually exists in Pakistan, that you cannot vote in elections unless you agree that the region is part of the Indian Union. And that's why the Hurriyat won't vote. Although they did vote in the previous elections, and this was before the Hurriyat was formed in 1987, and people have forgotten that the leader of the United Jihad Council, who sits in Muzaffarabad, Saeed Salahuddin, actually participated in the 1987 elections.
And lost.
And lost. That's the reason. And of course the Indian government says, well, who is this bunch of Hurriyat? They've never put themselves up for elections. We don't know who supports them. They don't have any representation. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because when Abdul Ghani moved towards trying to sort of say, well, maybe we should, participate, he then was assassinated, you see. So they maintain that position. They do get a lot of media coverage because they've got sort of a lot of connections with the media. But if you look at it from the Indian government point of view, they say they're just a bunch of protesters and they don't represent the true spirit of Kashmir, because Kashmiris do vote in elections, and that was their big flagship. Because for a long period during the 90s they couldn't hold elections, and then they began to hold elections. And there are a lot of Kashmiri Muslims, like Nabila Mufti, she's a Kashmiri Muslim, who supports India being part of Kashmir being part of the Indian Union. But as I said, Hurriyat don't participate for that region.
But Syed Ali Shaglani, he was a participant in the election.
He also participated.
So he did lose election, and that's why he got on the different bandwagon, wanting to create a different political hub for himself, not necessarily be part of the Indian side.
But a lot of them, again, I mean, as we were saying, it's their own little enclaves. They have their own little sort of power bases. And that is one of the problems, because the Hurriyat, it sort of had numerous political party membership. It was founded in 1983 to bring them together under Umar Farooq. But they've split again, and they are often splitting about what their objective is, and whether it's to be part of Pakistan. And Gilani, as you say, is wanting to be part of Pakistan. But it's whether they want part of Pakistan or independent, what shape that independence should take.
Susan, that's question.
Yeah, you were saying that you could get all the Kashmiris to sit around a table, but it's very distinct Shia, Sunni, Buddhist, Hindu, and if they all came together at a table, could they come together as maybe an independent place, or could they agree on some kind of solution? I'm just curious because it's very divided into areas. I have another question after that, but please.
I don't know that we'd have to see and
Yeah.
allow them to talk. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. I did say solution or solutions. There may be more than one solution. They may say, well, our particular area, we want it to be India, with India, we want it to be with Pakistan, we want it to be independent, we want to be with China, we want the UN to administer it. Might be something that we've never thought of, but I'm suggesting that they should be allowed to work out what they want. There's no reason why they couldn't communicate. Just because they're different religions doesn't. They do have things in common. For example, they are all part of that former princely state. They're contested, and they all feel to some extent or another suppressed, lack of political freedom. So there's a variety of things that do bring them together.
I also wanted to know about the media coverage. We, in our Courage in Journalism at our New Delhi Media Conference, we honored an Indian journalist who's based in Kashmir. I'm just wondering about the media coverage. Are there many journalists who are actually based there and have a good sense of the area and the news that we're getting about the area?
Well, before the journalist actually answers the question, I'll give you my opinion. This whole uprising has been very difficult because there have been people reporting from Kashmir for the Indian media who've been essentially accused of treachery. What you're saying about this particular issue is unacceptable. In other words, you're being anti-Indian. So there's been a degree of less than objective reporting at times and the media in India to some extent or another has gone into a frenzy, and it's all about this law and order thing. These Kashmiris have got to do what they're told, basically. It's very paternalistic, and some of the folk in reporting from Kashmir are following that adherence, adhering to that sort of strand of it's law and order, and this is what they're doing, and this is unacceptable. But there are some Indians, some non-Kashmiris, some Kashmiris as well, who are objective and who've said what's going on is terrible and we've got to do something about it. But there is this sort of strand of nationalism problem.
There are some very courageous journalists, Kashmiris. It's different for us when we go in, and I do know some journalists who've gone in and reported so sort of what they've seen, and then they can't go back in again. So one has to be reasonably cautious without self-censorship. But for those Kashmiris living in the valley, they're under a lot of pressure. And if they're not under a lot of pressure, their editors are, because of the advertising, because the Indians will pull the advertising from the journals. That said, the advent of the internet has changed things tremendously. And if you go online, you can find some pretty trenchant reporting from people within Kashmir. But friends of mine in this latest bout of uprising have been put under house arrest, taken off streets, not allowed to go to certain places they wanted to go to areas to report. they're always under pressure to report what they really see, because they've got their own lives, they've got their children's lives, and I'm afraid that the pressure is exerted in moments of crisis. And so I would certainly always encourage people to read as much as they can, and as sort of varied as they can, and know where those sources are coming from. But the Indian, obviously the Indian newspaper outlets, they're going to be pushing, as the Indian point of view, that these they're all terrorists. I mean, it comes down to semantics, is how you describe the individuals. And I know we're always very conscious as in terms of the way we report. As I said, the Pakistanis call their bits different things from what the others call. We try and go down the line: Pakistan administered, Indian administered, Kashmir. And you can do a certain amount, but not a group. You can't raise the roof if you're living in Kashmir. That's all kind of the pressure.
It's 1:00, and the conversation is very interesting. I'm sure if some of you have further questions, if you come up and talk to our speakers, maybe a last question, and then we'll.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask your opinion. Like every other year, when during the pilgrimage, it's a Hindu pilgrimage which goes to Amarnath. So during that time, you'll always see there's some sort of tension. So when Burhan Wani was killed, so everybody thought, okay, well, this is going to be for till the Amarnath Yatra is over, and then after that, everything would be normal. But the things happened that people start, getting the bullets, and they got killed, and then it kind of kept going. Now, since now there's no currency, the currency is illegal, what it was there in India, the Indian 1,000 rupees and 500 rupees. Now that currency they cannot give to the people who throw stones. So it all of a sudden is stopped.
Yeah, but there's no evidence to suggest that the two are linked. It's almost just coincidental, actually.
Well, it stopped. I mean,
I know it has
within 4 days.
It has, but we're now talking about 120. What did you say? Whatever days since the 9th of July.
Yeah.
8th of July.
Since July 7th. Yeah.
I think that's a convenient fact. The two are related. I think it's more of a coincidence than that's.
Or the winter.
And the winter. Yeah. I don't know. In other words, what I'd like to, it's that word arguably, I'd like to see a bit more evidence for the links between the paying of stone throwers and them getting paid. Who's paying them?
Well, that was established because my friend, he happens to be on the intelligence, who's the chief of the Jammu and Kashmir. He's still in there. So he knows where the money comes in. These people get 500 rupees every day for throwing the stones. And these are small kids, the age of 14, 13. And that's where when they get the pellets, because they have a reason to go out to make that 500 rupees. And in doing so, they get shot with the pellets. And then you have the more and more casualties. And none of his children live in Kashmir. His grandkids, they study in Delhi. They have education, but the Kashmiris don't.
Well, again, my radar's up. I'm very suspicious of that claim, and I would like to see some hard evidence. You may be correct.
I'm just
it seems very
throwing it, so.
I know the Kashmiris are proud people.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily poor people, many of them are, but to throw stones for 500 rupees, I think, is a very convenient explanation for a group of people who are incredibly frustrated because they've been suppressed for a long period of time, and they many of them, I think, see the Indians as being an occupying power. So, yes, 500 rupees would sound to me that they're exploiting the people who are paying them because they're going to throw the stones anyway.
The children, yes. Most of them.
I think one can't underestimate the disaffection, and this has been going on for a long time. Even before '88, there was a certain amount of disaffection. There was always, since '47, there's been this feeling that Kashmir is sort of special and suspicious. We don't get treated the way.
So it doesn't go back to 1971 when India went into Bangladesh and Buddha made it into a Bangladesh, the West Pakistan turned into Bangladesh, and then there was a grudge. They wanted to take the revenge for that. And
well, that's again, it's a sort of conspiracy theory that floats around, but that doesn't take into account what actually the local inhabitants feel. And if one wants to go back, if you think about it, the JKLF was founded in the 1960s, the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front. There's been always an element of disaffection, and as I said, it stems from this unheld plebiscite, and then it's sort of shift-shaped, changed sort of shapes and changed sort of projections. But there's always been this feeling of unresolved something, and it comes up with one generation, it goes down. People get tired, it comes up again. People read the history books and they sort of think about it, and then it comes up again in a different manifestation. But it's very convenient to sort of, as I say, use the conspiracy theory. But it actually, I think, is very dangerous because it ignores the real issues.
The other factor too is, we haven't talked about this, but the word Pakistan is a made-up word. It's an acrostic in which the K stands for Kashmir. And they were anticipating that the Maharaj would join them. It was 77% Muslim majority in 1947. Almost all of its major links, transport, economic, cultural, social, etc., were with parts that became Pakistan. And it's highly inefficient to leave the Kashmir Valley via Jammu, when the easiest way is down through Muzaffarabad and joining the Rawalpindi and the rail network there, or whatever. So, emotionally though, Pakistan, they talk about it being the jugular vein and the unfinished business of partition and this, that and the other. They find it really difficult to let go of Kashmir, by which they usually mean the Kashmir Valley. They mean the whole former princely state, but they particularly want that Kashmir Valley because of its reputation and its history and its all sorts of wonderful things that it offers the world. And that's part of the reason why they're not going to let it go either. So there's that aspect to the dispute as well. And some of the Kashmiris are pro-Pakistani, there's no doubt about it. They would like to join for historic reasons, maybe even for economic reasons sometimes too. So it's a really difficult situation to satisfy those aspirations. But equally, on the other hand, India says there's a place for people of all religions, which is true. I think India, to its credit, is a very successful secular democracy. It's under challenge a little bit now with the BJP government, but essentially it doesn't matter what your religion is in India. So they're saying there's a place for all people in India as well. So it's ultimately it gets down to this contest of ideas. But I think one of the aspects of that contest of ideas is that both India and Pakistan have forgotten about the people of Kashmir itself. Are you actually a Kashmiri citizen? Are you from?
No, I'm a US citizen, but I was born in Kashmir. My family still lives in Kashmir. So we're the Sikhs, and I think that's the only minority left there. Because that was
There are some Sikhs left.
whole Jammu and Kashmir was a Sikh state before the Maharaja Gulab Singh was given that. So no, we still live there, and Kashmiris, they were very kind people because, as I said, as an individual Kashmiri, you won't find a better person than them anywhere else. But when it becomes hajum, we call it like a mob, and then you have to run for your life.
I think any mob you have to run through.
Yeah.
It's not that. I mean, I just want sorry.
Did you want to?
No.
Okay, but this conversation could go on. It's so interesting and complex. But I want to please join me in thanking our